Welcome. My name is Buthena Baltaji, and I am the head of exhibitions and heritage exhibits at the National Museum of Qatar. We're thrilled to have you tonight to celebrate the opening of the On the Move exhibition. This project has been in the making since 2019 under the leadership of the National Museum Director and Qatar Museum's Deputy CEO, Sheikha Amna bint Abdulaziz Al Thani. This exhibition explores nomadic pastoralists from 3 regions, Qatar, Sahel Sahara, and Mongolia. I will now introduce the curators of the exhibition and the speakers for tonight's talk. Professor Lila Abu Lughod, the interpretive advisor of the project, is an anthropologist and the Joseph L. Buttenwieser Professor of Social Science at Columbia University in New York City. Her first 2 books, Veiled Sentiments, Honor and Poetry in a Bedouin Society, and Writing Women's Worlds, Bedouin Stories, were based on long-term ethnographic research in a community of Awlad Ali Bedouin in Egypt's Western Desert in the late 1970s and 1980s. Dr. Anja Fischer, the Sahel Sahara region co-curator, received her PhD in anthropology from the University of Vienna. She focuses on Sahara studies, in particular the work, mobility, and modernity of nomads. All of Dr. Fischer's fieldwork has been conducted in the Tamashiq language. She spent approximately 2 years in residence and conducted field research over a 10-year period in camps of Imohar, nomads in the desert of Algeria and Niger until 2011. Dr. Elizabeth Turk, the Mongolian region co-curator, is a research associate and affiliated lecturer in the Department of Social Anthropology, University of Cambridge. Dr. Turk's research explores health-related practices and strategies in Mongolia with particular focus on traditional, alternative, and nature-based therapies. Unfortunately, our third co-curator, Tanya Al-Majid, the Deputy Director of Curatorial Affairs at the National Museum of Qatar and the Qatar region co-curator of the exhibition, will not be able to join due to medical reasons. Please make sure your phones are on silent mode so that we do not disturb the speakers. I'll now pass on to Professor Lila Abu Lughod, the moderator of tonight's talk. Thank you.
Wow. Could you all hear? It was good. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Buthena. Thank you so much for introducing us, so I don't have to do all that. And welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to see people I've just met and people I've known for a long time and people I hope to meet. It's really an honor to be here, to be able to share with you some of the research and thinking that went into producing this magnificent exhibit. And I know some of you, I just took you around. I hope all of you will see the exhibit and that we'll come back again and again because there's so much in it that it would take hours to explain it all, but it's all self-explanatory if you come. So when I was invited about 2 years ago to help advise the development of this exhibit, I was thrilled for 2 reasons. First, I was excited because of how much I loved the research that I myself had done decades ago when I was a young anthropologist living with a group of former sheep and camel herders in Egypt's Western Desert. Technically, it's actually the northwest coast. And I have, right there. So I spent more than a decade, I think some of you know this, on and off living with this and writing about some families. This was one of the little girls from the group of Bedouin known as Awlad Ali, the tribes of Awlad Ali. And I've continued to be involved with them and in touch with them. I've watched her grow up to be the mother of, I think she has 4 kids now. And recently I lost our father of this family, who I was very close to, and recently also her mother, who was the person I spent most time with. So it's very sad, but I've continued to watch them grow up. And the initial inspiration for this exhibit was actually some tents. People keep asking, why these 3 groups, why this exhibit? And the National Museum of Qatar had an amazing collection of Imohar material goods, including a very, very rare kind of tent. So there were, and obviously they have a lot of material on Qatar and from Qatar. And that was the initial inspiration. And the people I lived with as well had tents that were originally woven by the women themselves, just like those found across the Arab world. Even though now they pretty much bring them out only for special occasions like weddings or funerals or salah, what was that, reconciliation gatherings. But what I remember most from living with them, my years living with them, was what happened when we hung out in the everyday tents that they pitched next to their now permanent houses. So they are settled, almost everybody. And these were made of burlap sacks lined with probably American wheat, donated by USAID. I'm not sure where they got the burlap. And they had patchwork inside. And they showed the women setting it up. And this was the kind of tent, more ordinary tents. So these weren't architectural marvels, but they were pretty wonderful. But the most important thing about them was that they were just the places where people sat and talked and cooked and argued and hugged the children and yelled at the children for messing up things, as we all do. So they spun wool, they did all their activities. They loved sitting in the tents, and they could see a long way, so they could see who was coming. It was much more comfortable than the houses that they lived in. But the point was that it was the people, what went on with the people inside these tents, that really mattered. This was actually from a wedding, and it'll be relevant for you in a minute. And then when I realized that one of the groups that we had a great collection from was the Imuhar from the Central Sahara that Anja will talk to you about, they were going to include this in the exhibit. I was even more excited, and this is kind of a confession, because it was actually a slide lecture by my undergraduate anthropology professor, Paul Reisman, in 1973, that had made me want to be an anthropologist and to live with pastoral nomads, and particularly this photo of Imuhar Tuareg visitor in Burkina Faso that he met, where he was doing field work with Fulani in the late 1960s. The T again. So the everyday sociality and sociability was what was intriguing to me. And I ended up working in Egypt instead. I wasn't lucky like Anja, but I had a wonderful, amazing experience, and I feel so lucky about that. But I worked in Egypt instead, which made more sense, given that they're Arabic speaking, and I didn't have to learn another language, but just get better at that one. And they were settled pastoralists who still had sheep herds and some camels for prestige, which you'll hear about, but their livelihoods depended on much, much more real estate deals, a bit of agriculture, growing palm trees, lots of businesses. Some of them probably illegal, but I never wrote about that. But I never lost interest in the Imuhar, the so-called Tuareg, and have come to appreciate much more about them, including, as some of you mentioned when we went through the exhibit, the compelling political music made famous by bands like Tinaroen and Bambino and others. But we managed to get one of Tinaroen's songs to play in the gallery. So they're famous on the world stage. But the second reason I was excited, so some of it's romantic, and we know to think differently about that. But the second reason I was really excited to be back in touch, I was excited to be back in touch with the dedicated professionals who work and believe in this incredible museum. And I'd had the privilege earlier of helping out in a much more modest way with the permanent galleries dedicated to the formerly mobile pastoralists of Qatar, about whom Tanya was going to talk to us about, and I'm sure some people here know a lot about as well. But I'd even taken, on that first trip, I'd taken a copy of a photography book composed of the photos taken in 1959 by the Danish archaeological expedition, and many of these photographs are in the exhibit, and actually some in Tanya's slides that I'll be showing with you. And I took a copy of that book, of those photographs, back to Egypt, to the communities that I lived with, and they were really intrigued and excited because some of the things they remembered having had in their lives, but it was a life they had lost touch with, and some things were still very current. So it was really fun, and so much was familiar to them. This was one of Yetta Bang's photographs of spinning. The women still spin wool, they still weave beautiful rugs and carpets. They call them blankets, but I didn't, so I was excited to come back and work here and help out, but I had no idea how much more I would learn from working on this exhibit. Especially because of the chance to work with this extraordinary group of curators who you're going to get to hear from. And their formidable knowledge and their expertise about their regions gave real content to this exhibit. And their experiences and their, I would say, very positive approaches to the people whose lives we were trying to bring alive in this exhibit made it, I think, analytically very fresh. So this is an exhibit with a very strong and distinct message. You'll see that when they talk with us. But before I invite them to talk with us, if you'll give me a little time, I just wanted to take a few more minutes to give you some glimpses, kind of behind the scenes, of the complex process that led us to the structure and the messages of this exhibit. So I'm a scholar, many of you know. I write, that's what I do. I'm used to working alone on my writing. So conceiving an exhibit is completely different. It's a collective project that unfolds over time in very unexpected ways and through many media. Our first challenge was conceptual, given that we'd chosen these 3 different regions to include what messages could and did we want to convey to the public about these kinds of groups who are on the move, as we call them, for their livelihoods, breeding, pasturing, and raising livestock. They're not refugees, migrants, forced to be on the move, as are those currently in the news, even if some are, sadly, also displaced into refugee camps or moved to cities. Refugee camp there, for the Imuhar. So how could we tell their stories? Through objects, through images, through sounds, with only minimal text. This is hard for us scholars. How could all the senses be engaged as we tried to share our knowledge and to represent worlds that might be unfamiliar to some? It was different from writing a book, though I'm proud of the exquisite catalog that we also wrote together to accompany the exhibit. And I'm going to do a little show. This is available in the book, in the gift shop, if any of you want to pick it up. Beautiful catalog. So the labor of so many dedicated and talented conservators, designers, engineers, media specialists, editors, scriptwriters, translators, and contractors was absolutely crucial to realizing the exhibit that you can see outside. That's just a shot from it for those who haven't had a chance. But I wanted to take you back to the beginnings to focus on the intellectual labor that we did to give it the framing and the structure, its narrative. And in that, Dr. Alexandra Bunia, who, is she not here? Oh, yeah, everybody's so exhausted from the process of getting it together. She was really our guru, if that's the right word, our teacher, our guide, our guru, I think, and with skill, with patience, with tact, with intelligence, she guided us, a group of specialist scholars, scholar curators who are sitting here. And if you've had the chance to see the herding game in the exhibit, you might think of her as having herded us into producing this thing. We each had very strong ideas about how to think about the pastoralists and herders that we know in Qatar, in Central Sahara and in Mongolia. And we had concerns about how to represent and how not to represent these unfamiliar communities and modes of livelihood. But what about the big picture? Alexandra Bunia, who is a museum studies specialist, had a truly remarkable gift for distilling ideas. She also taught us how to visualize our knowledge. After rounds and rounds of discussion and sharing ideas, one day she suddenly said, "Stop." She said, "Okay, you enter the first room of the exhibit. What do you see?" And we stumbled and we floundered and, we just didn't know. But slowly, we emerged with the key pieces of the story we wanted to tell. And now you have the experience of walking through these, I think, very clearly defined but richly imagined rooms, interconnected but distinct, the kind of, for me, chapters of a book. But whose ideas jump off the page and whose breathtaking and mundane objects, I think, cause wonder. So we started the exhibit, as you might expect in this day and age, with what's wrong with the fantasies, negative and positive, about these kinds of groups. And Edward Said has taught us all to think about this as Orientalism. And so, there's the herding game. We got it. You're familiar with these kinds of images of this part of the world, of nomads, of pastoralists. I found this book on my bookshelf, In Search of the Best Turk, and I'm donating it to Anja when the exhibit is over. And things like this. They're just caricatures of the kind of people that we know and love and wanted to represent differently. So although I learned from Alexandra at every single stage of this process, I'll never forget what she said to me when I said I was really troubled by the relationship between the research packs that our curators had. It was like formidable research that each of the curators had prepared as background for this exhibit. They'd practically written books as background, and we couldn't show all of that. And, it was just such a gap. And she said, an exhibition is just the tip of an iceberg. Without the deep research that lies below and supports it, it wouldn't be sound. And that's what comforted me through this whole process. And I think she's right. So we also worked with amazing people at the museum. I won't name them all, but especially Lina Patmali and then Shema Ayub, worked on so many details, including the exhibit trees. I'd never seen one of these. Those of you in museum studies probably know this is normal, but to me, wow. So we had the idea of the intimate relationship with the environment, and then we got, how did we distill the ideas into something that could be made into an exhibit with objects attached to each? So we got so many of these, and Lina worked hard on them. Sorry, got ahead of myself. So Alexandra sort of orchestrated this kind of wildly multi-pronged process that finally brought to sparkling iceberg, tip of the iceberg, physical life, what had begun as just a set of ideas about what we most wanted people to know about the groups that we knew something about. So she listened closely, she had made wise judgments, and she responded to everything from overall design of the space to audio visuals, from colors to catalog covers, from word limits, which we really fought against, on the wall captions, and also political sensitivities. And Alexandra was on the moves. I think of her as the on the moves Wizard of Oz. And I feel lucky to have been able to glimpse behind the curtain of how this all happened. I hope all of you know the Wizard of Oz. I know you're all eager to hear from the curators themselves and to ask them questions, and we'll have time for that. So I just wanted to share one last thought about the special challenges we face together in pulling together an exhibit as ambitious, I think, as this one was. We didn't have a simple task. We didn't have a collection of pearls to show. We didn't have a lovable sea creature like the dugong, right? You know what it's about. You know people are going to like that. We didn't have a clear subject at the beginning. We didn't have a famous architect. We had 3 regions. We were committed to preserving the specific histories and the circumstances of each of these communities that we included. And we were determined to show how pastoralists, herders, mobile herders were not timeless or remnants of the past. And we refused the hackneyed binaries of traditional and modern, backward and advanced. And although we don't confuse our own representations of these groups with their realities, we did all we could not to exoticize, not to objectify them. So that was the reframing of what we wanted to share with the public about their everyday lives, about their work, about their skills, about the incredible knowledge they have, and about their arts. The arts of living is the section we did on sociability, on hospitality, on the kinds of values that they have and that we would all share. So we actually all admire the creativity, their specialized knowledge, and their resilience. We deplore, especially making clear in the last section of the exhibit on ruptures, the natural, the economic, and the political forces that have made their lives difficult, challenging, precarious. We think there's a lot that we can all learn from them, actually, about living on this endangered planet in a different way, living well with other species, living well with each other, making what we use, including making our own entertainment, rather than consuming, destroying the environment, exploiting others, and using up valuable resources with unsustainable practices. And we insist on the specificities of their circumstances, of their political histories, the current challenges they face, which are all different. But we also kept looking for cross-cutting themes that might hold lessons for us all. And I will now turn it over to my colleagues to give you a chance to hear from them about how this all happened, especially from their perspective. So we have Dr. Elizabeth Turk, who's an anthropologist and at Cambridge. As you heard from Buthena, we have Dr. Anja Fischer, who's also an anthropologist and an architect, which was very useful for the tent, setting up the tent from the University of Vienna. And we were hoping, planning to have your own, Tanya Mejid, who's this amazing, devoted curator, long time at the National Museum of Qatar, and now Deputy Director for Curatorial Affairs. But unfortunately, she couldn't come. But Buthena had a message from her, which would come later. Buthena, are you here? Oh, do you want to do it now? Okay, when we get to where Tanya would have been, she did send us a message, and we'll go through her slides, and I'll say something about them because I also helped with the permanent exhibit, but I think there are probably people in the audience who could also help us if there are questions, who might know more about this situation. So I turned it over to Elizabeth Turk, Dr. Elizabeth Turk, and thank you for being here. And we'll have there we go. And remember that we'll have time for questions, but it'll be at the end after all the presentations. Thank you.
I think you did, yeah. Those two, okay. Small glitches. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. After a decade of research in Mongolia as a social anthropologist, and having spent 1/3 of that time living there, I have learned a great deal from the people I was fortunate enough to meet and spend time with. Whether in discussion with a medicinal plant harvester or mining engineer,
many expressed the distinctiveness of Mongolian culture not as a static and singular set of ideas and behaviors, but rather as a repertoire of diverse understandings and practices that is completely compatible with social progressivist movements taking place the world over. 1 year ago, I was having coffee with a digital specialist named Bilgun, who works at the National Museum of Mongolia, one of our partnering institutions on this project. We were at a coffee house in the country's capital city named Ulaanbaatar, just to give you a sense. At that time, he expressed to me that through his work, he wants to show how Mongolians are modern and technologically advanced, not the simple nomads that the world expects them to be. This exhibition shares Bilgun's interest in presenting a more accurate depiction of Mongolians through the life experiences of mobile pastoralists. In part thanks to the legacy of scientific and social advancements of the state socialist period, from the introduction of veterinary care to the institutional organization of herding and farming collectives. Herding practices today are skilled, sophisticated, and coordinated. Delivering this message in a clear and engaging way in part makes this exhibition unique. By confronting negative stereotypes of Mongolians as timeless, simple nomads, this exhibition presents people as inside history. This means highlighting social, political, and economic change with particular focus on colonial and global political economic forces. However, Mongolian herders are not passive victims of such larger transnational influences. Mongolians who herd choose to do so. Many take great pride in the occupation, despite the myriad challenges of work that holds great value in the national collective imagination. For instance, as a practice that began in the second half of the 20th century to valorize working class exemplars, every year national champion herding households from the 21 provinces and Ulaanbaatar are named. And I don't have the little medal that some of you know is my absolute favorite piece in the exhibition from the Mongolian side, but keep an eye out for it. We have a medal from one of the herding collectives. Mongolian animal husbandry revolves around 5 kinds of livestock: sheep, goat, cattle, horses, and camels, all of which are milked. While in the past, sheep wool and camel hair were the main fibers harvested, goat hair is increasingly valued for domestic and international cashmere trade. Maybe even your cashmere sweater is made from Mongolian goat fibers. The early 1900s saw a political, that's not correct, let me rephrase, not the early 1990s, so very recently. The early 1990s saw a political and economic shift from nearly 7 decades of a state socialist government and centralized economy to multi-party system and marketized economy. This shift impacted many aspects of life, including land ownership regimes and the organization of herding practices. Mineral mining, increased number of livestock, especially goats, and eroded institutional structures through decollectivization have all contributed to increasingly fragile landscapes. Today, approximately 70% of Mongolia's pasture lands are degraded, presenting challenges to mobile pastoralists. However, herders bring great creativity and innovation to their profession. Historically, households moved 2 to 4 times a year, typically between summer and winter camps, maximizing grazing capabilities of open valleys and access to water in the summer, while benefiting from mountain shelter from the winds in the winter months. Now, increasingly, herders find that they need to move more frequently to fodder livestock. But as I mentioned, Mongolian herders have been creative in coming up with solutions. A story about a herder named Munk Jargal went viral in 2020 when photographs of him were widely shared on social media. Munk Jargal had converted a 25-seat bus into a mobile home out of which he herds in spring and autumn. In an article written about him in the Daily News, Munk Jargal is quoted saying, "It's easier for animals to gain weight if they are able to follow clean water and fresh grass. When you build a gir, or a yurt, there's a lot of work to be done, such as building it, unloading and loading. And so I asked myself, I couldn't possibly take a big bus to the pasture, could I? So he went to Ulaanbaatar, bought a 45-seat bus, the warranty of which had expired, and drove it back to Sukhbaatar province, where he lives. He emptied out the chairs and moved furnishings typical of a gir inside, arranging a few beds, 2 chests, a cupboard, and so on. He claims that the extra height allows him to keep a better eye on his pasturing livestock. I heard about this story from a friend, and at that time had already started work on this exhibition. The friend helped me track down Munk Jargal to ask him for permission to use his photographs. He lives rurally, obviously, oftentimes in places without 4G or data to check his email or send a Facebook message. He lives very far from the province center where he might find a printer to sign forms. So from July to October of this year, so 4 months' time, we liaised back and forth through my Mongolian friend and her 13-year-old son, whose English is really good, to communicate back with the museum and vice versa. So there were something like 6 of us involved in this chain of emails and trying to track down Munk Jargal and get a signature and this and that. This is the kind of behind-the-scenes detail that illustrates not only the complexity of creating an exhibition about contemporary people, but also the colliding worlds and the mismatch between temporalities and everyday rhythms of life. We are so thrilled to be able to show a few of Munk Jargal's images, so keep an eye out, as they are an important reminder of the innovation herders bring to their profession today. A second important message from On the Move is about working together and helping each other through informal networks of care. Without the institutional support of collectives from the Soviet period, families today share their labor and assist one another, especially at labor-intensive times of the year, such as spring, when shearing takes place. It is not uncommon for herding families to live together on the same encampment, called hotel, an example of which you'll see here. And if you keep an eye out in the exhibition, you'll see several of these kinds of joint living encampments that are really useful for people. So it's much easier to pool your labor, for example, and take care of your uncle's herd when he's away in the city when you live right next door. Other examples of informal networks of care can be found in connections between rural and urban dwellers, between countryside and city. Herders send meat and dairy products from the countryside to their urban kin, who in turn house rural relatives when they attend university or have a doctor's appointment. So things like this would be sent from the countryside to the city, and conversely, rural dwelling family members could find a place to stay in an apartment building like this, which is typical of a middle-class family in Ulaanbaatar. Another example of such assistance can be found in grandparents taking care of childcare duties, especially during summer months when children have a break from school and parents send the kids to the countryside relatives. Not uncommon from other places in the world too. Here, social connections are crucial to navigating the unique challenges of living during a time marked by ecological precarity and globalized capitalism. All of us, in one way or another, face the challenges of living during this unique time in history. I'm exceedingly grateful to my colleagues here at the National Museum, my co-curators, and our partnering museums. I'm especially thankful to our Mongolian co-collaborators, several of whom have joined us here in Doha and are at this event tonight. Without them, without you, you know who you are, this exhibition, as you see it today, would not have been possible. So thank you.
Yeah. Hello. Can everybody hear me? I hope so. So thank you. Let's start. As an anthropologist, I prepared myself for field research among a group of Turk nomads known as Kel Ahnet, people of the Ahnet in the Algerian Sahara, by studying the classic ethnographic literature. But I did not know how to dress, like you see, what to eat, and had only basic knowledge of Tamashek language. During 10 years of research for about 3 months every winter, in which I moved through the Central Sahara with this group, I learned how little I was prepared for everyday life in the desert. In case you don't know, I'm the one with the black thing wrapped around in the middle. More than 3 million Turk live in the middle of the largest hot desert on Earth, the Central Sahara, in an area of 2 million square kilometers, 170 times larger than Qatar. And they are divided in countries like Algeria, Libya, Mali, Niger, and Burkina nowadays. The society is widely known as Tuareg, but this is an inappropriate name, like a gypsy. They call themselves Imoha in my research area. The around 150 nomads of the Kel Ahmed live in the hottest mountain area of the Central Sahara, in a large area as large as Belgium. Imoha do not live in sand areas, like probably some of you imagine. They live in valleys of old dry rivers, in mountain regions, in 7 large mountains regions in the middle of the Central Sahara. Once I made my first research, I arrived at the red point, and I was catched again after 3 months in this red circle in the middle. And they move around. I nearly know every area on this card after these 10 years. I traveled in these 10 years mostly with this family, from the wife, which is a woman in front right. From the wife, I learned all kinds of work a woman has to do. The father, which is standing next to the tent, is a leader of the camp. Of about 3-4 tents that depends on the climate condition. He is the youngest of the group, but very smart. One evening we sat together in front of the tent. He recited about 10 large poems from memory. I was more than impressed. And this is an image of a camp in such a green valley, a former riverbed. Nowadays, and you can see 3 tents in front and 2 further away. Nowadays, they live in tents with canvas, as you see, the green ones, with a canvas cover. In former days, they use the same wooden under construction, but with a leather cover like this. This image was my model for our tent in the exhibition. And I'm proud to present in the exhibition the first time worldwide real stretched large leather tents. And this is owned by the Museum of Qatar. Since I built up so many times a tent in the desert in the 10 years, my main goal was to set, even in this exhibition, set up a real proper leather tent of the Imoha. And I hope, yes, I think I got it. The tent is empty. Because it's a sleeping room of the nomads. Only 2 very beautiful large bags are hanging on the sidebar as a wardrobe. But they are usually covered here, as you see, up with cotton clothes. And they are at the same time transport containers. They are real minimalists. They do not use beds, since they often move every 2 weeks to another valley. You will definitely also think twice if you carry a large bed with you. Since minimalists in Europe try to minimalize themselves down to 1,000 objects, a whole family need only around 150 objects on 3 camels for their whole household, including dwelling. The last camel carried the tent and supplies. The second, the kitchen and the little children. The first one for clothes, private items, and the saddle of the woman. They are masters of teamwork, like the team of the National Museum of Qatar. They can do, the woman can do the saddle by their own. Here we have a preparation of one of these saddle, which I could be with them. An expert woman can build up this complex structure of one of these woman camel saddle without measuring tapes in an afternoon. I cannot do this, that's for sure. Here it's you can see one of these three-dimensional structure a woman made with the help of others in an afternoon. In this other image, we can see the cooperation of the woman by making a new cover of the tent for one of the women out of old clothes. So they lead a very sustainable life, but they do not work for free, as we all. They are not stupid. They knew the new owner of the saddle or the tent has to kill a goat and prepare a good, delicious dinner with a lot of meat. These people have often the image of being poor. In reality, they are much richer than their relevance in the villages. Each of these goats are worth around $50. And this is a herd of one family only. Every man and every woman owns a white long-leg camel, the red Ferrari of the Sahara Desert, which are very expensive. The relevance here, the relevance come to a wedding often only with borrowed cars to give a kind of impression. One of these white long leg camels cost at least $500 or more. The relevance in live in small houses like this. This is Agadez in Niger, where the women normally stay at home and cannot walk around. I once talked to a widow in the desert if she does not prefer to live in the city. She said that she feels locked up in the city and she prefers her life in the desert where she can go out and whenever she wants and meet the neighbors or friends. However, since 2012, I cannot go for field work anymore due to political issues in Mali. Since then, 30,000 nomads from Mali live in refugee camps in Burkina Faso, led by the UNHCR. I was there in 2016 in mission asked by the UNHCR, and they are still in this camp, 2022. So, however, I hope this exhibition, with this exhibition, the visitor can learn something about this creative, sustainable, rich, minimalistic society, like I learned so much by my friends on this seen on this image. But as you see on the image as well, as you've seen on the image as well, I am still learning how to dress appropriate after 10 years of living with these wonderful people. However, I'm honored to may present together with this professional team of the National Museum of Qatar and my co-curators a fresh, modern approach about a nomadic pastoralist apart from classic prejudice and this fantastic exhibition. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anja. As you all know, Tanya Al-Majid wasn't able to make it tonight. She wanted me to just read over one paragraph of her section, which I'll just try to move towards. And then essentially we can move on to the question section after that. So I'll just go, this is Tanya's words. When I first heard about the concept of the On the Move exhibition years ago, I was anxious and worried due to the fact that the National Museum of Qatar has an entire permanent gallery dedicated that showcases and highlights life in the desert. I was worried that we would be repeating or duplicating content, which really didn't make sense at the time. I remember in almost every meeting with my co-curators during our long Zoom calls, repeatedly saying, you know, this is a big challenge to kind of recreate this exhibition, but through a different perspective. So I had time to think of ways to represent similar themes, ideas, and objects, but in a different way. And through this exhibition, we were able to accomplish that, I believe, quite successfully. It was a challenging process, and we wrote hundreds and hundreds of pages of research that included historical research, object-based research, oral histories, and archival material, long hours of brainstorming, and studying every aspect of this exhibition. It has been by far one of the most exciting exhibitions I've ever had the pleasure of working on, and I am truly honored to have worked with such professional and passionate people. And I do hope I can collaborate in future projects. So I'm just going to skim through her photos. However, you know, with her not being here, we don't think we should cover this section. Hopefully, you'll be able to hear her story in the exhibition if you haven't been already. Okay, so Professor Lila, I'll hand over to you, and then whenever you're ready, we can go to questions.
Is this on? Can you hear anything? Okay, thank you so much. Yeah. Thanks, and we're really disappointed that Tanya couldn't come. And I just wanted to say a few things about that, and hopefully people here will know even more than I do about it. But the slides you just saw, I think pretty much all of them were taken, and many of them are in the exhibit, some of them are in the permanent gallery. They were taken by a Danish archaeological expedition in 1959. So it was on the cusp of oil. Oil had been discovered. It was beginning, some of these people were beginning to work in other fields because of the discovery of oil. But we're actually so fortunate that there was this expedition, and it included a Klaus Ferdinand, who maybe he was an archaeologist, he must have been, but he was very interested in the community and in the material artifacts, and they actually have many of those artifacts in museums in Denmark, which maybe someday we'll talk about, and bring them back. But they also had along with them this remarkable woman photographer, Danish woman photographer, single woman who had done photography. She'd gone on this trip, a couple of trips to Greenland, which the Danish had colonized, working with Inuit and looking at the kind of transformations going on there because of the colonial presence. And she went on dog sleds and she did all this stuff which the macho explorers who I've read, like Knud Rasmussen, you know, how hard it was with the dog sleds through the snow. And this woman did it by herself, you know, with a few friends, and didn't complain about it. So I really admire her, and I wanted to write a book about her, an article about her. There's a little bit we know, but she clearly really took to this. She didn't know this part of the world, but she did live with these two different groups in Qatar who were very pastoral nomads. And from her diaries, from the things she wrote about them, and from some of the photographs, you just see how much she loved being here, and she loved being with them. And one of the guys I just noticed with long hair, because they had long hair, young guy, and she's this blonde Danish photographer. She's combing his hair. And you know, she's helping people sew things. She, you know, hugging the kids. She really loved being here, and she writes very sympathetically. So I think there are times when we can do that, and her photographs are a remarkable record because there isn't much else, you know, pictorial to show what that way of life was. So I love these photographs, actually, and they really are helpful. And what you don't notice when we did the permanent gallery, I wanted there to be a competition, you know, for kids or something like, you know, they've got the camels and the tents, and it looks so traditional and so alien. And yet the little girl holding two camels is using detonator wire to hold them. One other guy standing with a camel wearing Converse sneakers and an overcoat. You know, this is a world, and one of the images I think in here was also this inner tube of a truck or a big car that they turned into a water carrier. So already all the elements of this transformation are present in here, but you're sort of overwhelmed by the romanticism and the nostalgia and something else. But if you pay attention, they captured all these transformations that I think are really important and part of the message that we wanted to convey about people in history, people always changing, and she captured them at a moment in time, but they were all, you know, they had other ways of living, other places they lived, and were transformed into this. So I like those because they're sort of your fantasy about Bedouin, but they actually show you, you know, the living realities and transformations. So I don't think I will talk about them other than that, but they're this kind of remarkable archive. Oh, and one more point about it that I wanted to make, and I pointed this out to some of the people I took on the tour. There's also a film. We have some very interesting documentary footage in the exhibit that's supposed to bring alive the items that you're seeing in front of you. They're part of everyday life. People use them. People make them. And there's a film called Bedouiner that was also made by Jette Bang, this Danish photographer, 1959, of packing up a community and traveling on the camels. And the whole film, it was very badly, you know, not in good shape, but they've managed to make it high quality now, and the whole thing is being shown in our exhibit, which is a really important thing. It's never been shown in full. I think a part of it is in the permanent galleries, but only a snippet because it wasn't of the quality then that it could have been. So you should watch it sometime when you have time to go back. So I think at this point we would love to turn on the lights. I believe they're going to, so that we can actually see you and talk to you. And we open up the floor to any questions, and we'll, to any of us, but especially these fantastic curators who worked how many hundreds of hours, making sure that this was really sound, this exhibit. And hopefully the messages got through, but we would love to hear about that from you. So I think without further ado, we have about half an hour to have a talk with you, any questions you have. And I think there are microphones around, so if you raise your hand, they'll bring them to you. Unless you want to, did either of you want to say anything else now, or just, we'd like to hear from you. It's hard to see, but don't be shy. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Now you have to fight over who gets the microphone to who. Thank you.
My name is Nemanja.
Can you hold it up close?
Yes.
They're not.
I have a question, and I believe maybe for any one of you, because you spoke a bit of creating an exhibition and trying to represent different kinds of the Bedouin lifestyles across the globe. When it comes to building the exhibition as a curator, how much did you have to sacrifice of your maybe knowledge in order to fit the narrative explained through the physical presence of the objects, if that makes sense? So are there parts of the stories that you couldn't maybe say because you didn't have a physical material to support your thoughts, or did you still manage to get your full experiences of these different nomads in the exhibition?
Thanks for the question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, hold it up.
Great, perfect. Well, it's a great question, and I think we all of us in the curatorial team came from very different theoretical backgrounds, different things that we want to highlight, different things that we're passionate about, and so it took us a lot of conversations and trying to figure out what exactly are the common themes here. In a way that evades a sort of a comparative framework, because after all, that's not the most interesting bit at the end of the day. I think with anything, when you have a dream and it's just your dream, that's one thing. But when it's a shared dream, I think there's some concessions that just happen along the way. And that's just part of working as a team. I think, maybe perhaps Anja, will speak about it too, and Lila as well. But I think there's some things that we weren't willing to compromise on, but at least for me, that list got smaller and smaller because there are just constraints. There are constraints of the exhibition. As you say, we're dealing with contemporary peoples, but we're using mostly objects from the past. That was massively challenging, and for Inner Mongolia and the Mongolian region in that, it's an issue because a lot of these objects were taken away by certain explorers who had their own vision of what Mongolian culture was, and they went at a certain point in time, and they went to one village in Inner Mongolia or Mongolia and brought certain things back. And so then you've got to try to diversify. Otherwise, you're just redoing, an exhibition about an explorer who went to a village in Inner Mongolia and brought back a bunch of things. So in that sense, partnering with the National Museum of Mongolia and the National Gallery was huge for the Mongolian side. It was absolutely huge. Before that partnership was made, I was very worried. So we are so pleased that we got to partner with them.
Yes. As Lila mentioned, my research package, for example, is 170 pages. And we had so much ideas and stories to tell. And in my case, I had a lot of objects, about 600 objects from this museum. But in classic Turek exhibition, you see weapons, male saddles, silver jewelry laying around as representative objects from this culture. But we try to tell stories with this. Like I give only an example, in the Rupture section, we have a painting, we have a picture of this third largest uranium mine. So all these natural resources that is found on the land of the Turek, like uranium, gold, and they have gas and oil, and they must be rich. In reality, in Crossroads, we show the pouches of them, that they are also very representative, but in reality, there's a little case inside. You hardly can do a bill inside, but not even a coin. So in comparison, they are rich in natural resources, but poor in money. So we try to build with these around the object stories. And not only lay this around like usually like a dollhouse, stuffed up with things. So we try to bring stories around objects. I hope like the saddle, teamwork with the saddle. So all how they work together explained on the saddle, not only show a nice saddle, but also, and this is the new approach we try to bring over in this exhibition. So it was definitely hard to minimize the objects and minimize our stories. But we have three cultures even to present. But I think it's kind of succeeded in this case. It's full of information, but it works. It goes out.
Yeah, and that's been one of the really interesting things for me, because as some of you know, my first work from the research that I did with Dali was about poetry and storytelling and songs, and that is very hard to represent in a museum, which you have to display objects, and it's very hard to get oral poetry. It's very hard. The arts, the verbal arts, are very hard to depict. You could have soundscapes. I mean, we talked about all the ways, we tried to talk about the imagination. It was a very important part of our research packs and our thinking about the exhibit. But how do you illustrate the imaginative worlds that people live in and the arts that they produce through objects? So we have musical instruments, but they're in a case. But musical instruments are meant to be played and to make music with people. So we take them out of their context of use and all the creativity that goes into producing the songs and the music and the poetry, and we put it in a case to kind of gesture to that aspect of life. But I felt frustrated. I've always felt frustrated, even with the permanent galleries. I kept saying, we have to have the poetry on the walls, but if you write poetry on the walls, that's also not the way it's lived. That's not the way people share it with each other. So to me, that was the one hardest challenge, that we have to speak through material objects about the worlds that people inhabit in their social lives and in their imaginations. And if you say, we're working in 3 different languages, one of which would be understood by some people here, although everybody speaks a dialect, and say the Awlad Ali dialect is sort of Libyan. It's not the same as Qatari dialect. So it is Arabic, but it's a very different Arabic. So would we write it on the wall? If you heard it, it would just sound weird because you don't understand it. How do we convey that? Because to me, that's part of what I think, and I said in my introduction, something about learning to entertain ourselves. You know, it's amazing. To me, you said you heard this incredibly long, long poems that people have memorized. These are known, people quote from them. How do you capture that in an exhibit? So the one place where I think we tried, is that the only one? So we just flounder, how can you, it's so important to people, music. So we have the Teneruan singing, and we have 3 musical pieces as soundscapes, and we have the sounds of goats and cows and bells and things like that to give you a sense that this is the world, the auditory world that you live in. But what we ended up doing was there's one animation that's based on a folktale. There was I don't know if he's here, a project from Qatar University where students went out and interviewed their grandparents to collect stories and folktales from them, but they were then written down. But we had English translations of Arabic translations into modern standard Arabic of these songs, but they captured something, and so we took one of them that is very well-known. At the end of it is a kind of very well-known proverb in Qatar and elsewhere in the Arab world, but Arabia, I think I've seen it in other places, but it was a well-known proverb, which is, the person who doesn't know the falcon, doesn't know what a falcon is, grills it, just eats it. And there's a whole story that goes with it about somebody using his falcon to hunt for game to help a community that was in a drought and short of food. And then somebody else just found it and grilled it and gave it to the owner. And it's about about valuing what you have, not going for short-term gain. Like, oh yeah, we can have one meal, but once you've killed the falcon, you have no other way of getting any more prey. So we tried with that folktale, but it's an animation. But still, that was, it's like a hint of the rich world that people live in and stories that they share. But to me, I think it's a really good question, always about museum exhibits. You have to speak, you have to tell your story through the objects, and you can't capture what all aspects of everyday life are. So thank you for that. Uh-oh. You want to go again?
Hi, I enjoyed your remarks immensely. Thank you so much. Leila, I think you read my mind and answered the first question about the challenge or what you would have loved to include that you weren't able to. But this is a general question about the Danish expedition and about the explorers. Since we talk about material objects, was there any time when you discussed any issue pertaining to looting and cultural restitution? If yes, what and what do you expect to happen next?
I can speak briefly to that point. So the answer to the last question, I had mentioned this amazing collaboration between the National Museum and in our exhibition, and also the National Gallery. And I think that really moves in a direction towards decolonizing museum studies and museum exhibitions. We would have very much had to have dealt with that issue head on had we gotten more objects from partnering institutions in the Western part of the world. So we don't have very many objects from, say, we have some from Quai Branly in Paris, one from Stockholm, and a few from Welt Museum, maybe one for the Mongolian side. So I felt confident that the ratio of objects and where they came from, that we were telling a more positive story than we were one that was sort of sweeping colonial pillaging under the rug.
Yeah, and maybe just talk about, this is also the National Museum of Qatar, and one of the communities we're talking about is Qatar, and the material, most of it is here. I mean, all the material, I don't think we borrowed from anywhere. There are other kinds of things elsewhere in the world, but we used the collections, I think, exclusively of the Qatar Museum, and it is from the place itself. So that I felt also very comfortable about, and our curators who work on the Qatar section are based here, and so I didn't think we had the same looting problems. And I think the question is for the Imuhar, and again, that was a very interesting collection. There's some things that are borrowed. There were some things that were refused to us from elsewhere, from Europe, for reasons we couldn't talk about, but and I think are problematic, that we couldn't have Qatari objects here, but also the Tuareg things. And we looked for museums in the region. I mean, it was a very difficult, volatile time, I think, for the Imhar. Obviously, it's dangerous to travel. There aren't the kinds of institutions that you could have borrowed from the region because of their situation there. But we did have this collection here, which is very interesting. I know that all of it was bought pretty recently. That was in boxes in the basement because of an earlier exhibit that had been planned. So things purchased in Burkina Faso and elsewhere. So they weren't colonial looting. They were bought in place, as far as I know. And maybe you can talk about that. But I think that was where we felt, I felt comfortable about the Qatari representation, because it's Qatari material that is here. The Mongolian museum was so generous, and it was a real collaboration to get the material. And they were, I don't know if they're here, but they were very excited to have it be shown here in this exhibit. It was a really important move because they hadn't ever lent anything, right?
Just the National Gallery, first time that that anything has left the National Gallery, and we've got 4 pieces from them, 3 of which are called national treasures. So we are so thrilled.
Yeah, but I think the issue comes up with the Imuhar material, but I think it was, as I understand it, we don't know quite all of it, but it was recently purchased as part of a project. Okay.
Yeah.
There's plenty of things that were taken. I mentioned the museums in Denmark that wouldn't lend us stuff.
Yeah,
Qatari stuff.
Most of the objects are most of the objects in the Imuhar after the colonial period. I think 2 pouches are from this, leather pouches. But we don't have, the silver is also after the colonialism. So we don't have we don't use stolen silver or gold or bronze statues from Burkina Faso, something like this. So I'm quite comfortable with a tabak leather pouch from the desert to expose here.
Could you just say what also you told us at breakfast today about the exhibit and the response?
Oh, yes. I can tell you, I sent yesterday night some pictures from our exhibition to my friends in the Sahara Desert, and they already, I think it's faster than the wind. It goes to Paris or something else, some response, and they are very happy. First time I can show you pictures of leather tents where they only have some poles and lay the leather cover on top and write Turk tent. I was really disturbed, and like the people are disturbed, and they are so happy that it's first time they see such a well-made tent, and they always push me, do this correct, otherwise you get some problems, and I don't want to have problems there, of course, and they are so pleased with the colors. This fits so perfectly to the colors of the desert. We have this blue in section 6 with the bed. I already get it back from somebody who sent it, and they are really pleased and sent all the best. This was the first. I have to check my account again.
I think now it works. Thank you so much for your time and for the exhibition, and thank you so much, Dr. Abu Lughod, for the generous time of giving us a tour. My name is Hatem. I'm from the Women's Society and Development Program at HBKU.
Can you slow down a little bit?
Okay, sure.
Hold the microphone closer. Yeah.
Does this work now? Okay, so my name is Hatem. I'm from the Women's Society and Development Program at HBKU. So thank you so much for the exhibition. Thank you so much for your generous time taking us through a tour. I had a couple of questions, but I will just kind of try to kind of make them one in a sense, but they build on some of the conversation that we've been sort of talking about, which is issues of positionality. And as you said, Dr. Abu Lughod, you spend a great deal of your work reflecting on that, as well as you said that, for example, for scholars, there is kind of space to reflect on that in terms of writing. So how does that necessarily translate or not translate in works like museums? And I think you also scrutinize like the form and what it means to kind of play with the form. And do you think this is maybe a good form to reflect on one's positionality in creating this work, and also inviting us to kind of think about what it means to depict folks on the move in defiance of nations in a national museum, and what does that kind of mean in terms of your work. And finally, I was really intrigued by one of the games, I think, where it had female and male and then a child, and I was wondering if there was any sort of reckoning with maybe homoeroticism in terms of these communities, and if it was depicted or if it was deliberately taken out of the way that it was kind of pictured, and if that necessarily of the form has necessitated that, or the politics of being in a national museum, or the politics of recognition and what it means, for example, to recognize these people even as kind of dynamic rather than static cultural objects, and what does that mean to kind of engage in that representation while there are material kind of realities that people have kind of lived and endured because of systems that are nation states, borders, colonialism, etc., etc. So I would just invite you to kind of reflect and help us kind of think through, and I want to reiterate and thank you so much again for the time.
Thank you. I love this game especially because I had the idea. Because normally you only see the naked tent and you get no explication. If you go to an apartment, European apartment, you are well informed. Okay, this is the door for the bathroom. This is the sleeping room, and you know where the kitchen is. Because they have walls, yeah. And in this, in an Immoa tent, they have no walls, but there are so much private spaces. Like tourists used to go directly in the tent. This is totally forbidden. This is their sleeping room. You don't want any visitors in your sleeping room, and they go with the shoes in the sleeping room. You have to. They are very clean people. You have to put out your shoes. And they have other museums. I saw that all the kitchen things are on the right side. The kitchen is always on the left side, and I want to show all these invisible walls, all these invisible rooms with this. You cannot see. And I try to analyze this because I made so much things wrong. I went in the sit in the wrong position. And they never said to me, you sit in the wrong position. I learned this afterward that I sit in the wrong position. So it was for me very important to show not only the object but all the invisible, forbidden things behind. What a guest has to do. This is a gender-separate society, and there's room for women, room for men, room for children. So we try to build up this story in a game. It was probably we don't think on everything, but we at least started to bring this in such a museum, these invisible things to show. So.
Absolutely, and building on that point, for sure, we wanted these home spaces to come alive. They're not just the physical structures, they're the lived spaces inside. For the Mongolian side of things, there's a great article by my former PhD supervisor named Professor David Sneath. It's called Enacting and Transacting, and I forget what the colon subtitle thing is. But essentially, it's about the fact that roles in Mongolia they're not static and fixed. You slide into them based on what you're expected to do when. Right? So if you're the host, if someone's coming to your house, you slot into the role of the host. When you're going to someone else's house, you slot into the role of the guest. And that can transcend different genders, different sexualities, different, across sort of different roles that one might play. So for instance, in Mongolia, increasingly, men are taking up more of the cooking, domestic role in the household because of the erosion of schools, of the school structure that was built up during the state socialist period. So now mothers have to travel with their children to the district centers and stay with them overnight with other relatives and things for schooling. So dad stays home and takes care of the whole household. Really tough work. I mean, you're both making sure that the gyid is warm in the winter and also out herding in the day. Really tough work. So anyway, the whole point being that in that sense, he's slotting into the role of cook, woman, on that side of the home, living in the kitchen space and that sort of thing. And I want to really give a shout out to Marie. Really did amazing work. I thought this was the thing I was skeptical the most about. In the exhibition, I was really digging my heels in, and then through lots of conversations about the fact that these small little sentences that we give about insight into those roles, they're not the end all be all, and they're not static. It's not like other people can't pass into those places and this and that. So we tried our best. If you're interested in more on this, look up Enacting, Transacting by Sneath. Yeah.
You can tell he's a student, right? So we're gonna assign you homework. Yeah, but I'm sure other people want to talk, but I just wanted to acknowledge the questions that you're asking, which are very difficult. And as you said, and somebody interviewed me, you're so involved in positionality and questions of positionality. And obviously, we were in an awkward position as curators representing not ourselves and not being able to say who we were and why we were doing it this way. And I think this is perennial. And I think the question of museums is also a big question. And I actually, I had to think about it because I actually always loved museums ever since I was a kid. So my critical faculties sort of break down there, that I actually think something can happen through them. And they're, as scholars, who's going to read? I mean, thank you for reading my work, but how many people are going to learn from the way I think or what I've learned about the world or how I want to represent things? And you think of a museum as offering the possibility with all its limitations, but all its incredible, possibilities of teaching in a different way and reaching a bigger public than any of us would through our scholarship, but hopefully our scholarship informs the way we put this together. But in the end, I think you're sensitive, and maybe Ragaya is also sensitive to the fact that we were representing these communities. We think there's more involvement, at least in some of it, and our involvement as scholars who, have invested 10, 20, 30 years of our lives in thinking about and trying to understand these communities. If we represent that better, then the little passageway where you see all those Orientalist artifacts. We hope that it can do more, but I think, and it reaches more people. And even the games, you know, I was dubious, you know, what can you learn? But I think you learn something, and you reach a younger audience, maybe, who will never read our work, but they could learn, you know, they could think about social space, they could think about social roles, they could think about communities in a different way, but we don't, you know, we never know what the reception is of all our work. But I think, you know, really appreciate the question. They're perennial, and I think we all struggle with them, but we think maybe something, there are possibilities of reaching and, you know, sharing what we know more broadly that are worth the risks. But we would love to hear your reactions to the exhibit, not right now, but in general, because did it work, or does it still objectify in the ways that we didn't want to, but you take it as a group. We have time for a couple more. Did you want to speak? And sorry, I'll try to get you next. Oh yeah.
Thank you. My name's Shema. So one of my questions is, would have been for Tanya, but she's not here, so hopefully someone can answer it. When it comes to the women weavers, you know, when it comes to tent making, it's specific knowledge of women. How was that represented? How were the women represented properly? Did you go into the community? Were they included in the research? Have they seen the exhibition?
This is my special field because I lived with women the whole time, the whole 10 years. And a normal Imuha exhibition, you always have the weapon and the male saddle. And here we have the tent. This is always, women are the architects of the tent. And we have a good tent in this case. And have a good look at the woman camel saddle. This is, I think, only I know from one exhibition where we have some. Now we have a woman camel saddle, a very nice one, and we are explaining teamworks. And I wrote an article about women teamwork. You can, they are always experts who build this. So it's like our teamwork, there's always a leader. And so we tried, especially at this point, bringing in the aspect. I think we talked yesterday about this, how much women gender aspects we brought in compared to much other things, like the milk economy, how important women are the most important part here. They are chiefs of the milk economy, and without this milk, nobody can survive there. And they're responsible for the goats. The men are for the camels, and you cannot survive without goats in the desert. You can survive without camels, but you cannot survive without goats. And the women are responsible for the goats and the home. So I think we brought this in, and it was from everybody from us, there's a main aspect to highlight this important position of the woman in this society.
Thank you, but my question was specific about the Qatari weavers.
Yeah.
So
well, I can, I think somebody else could probably answer that about bringing in the community. I think that's which is a great.
I don't know if it's done or not, but like, because I work with the last 52 weavers in the country, and I'm constantly with them, and I live with them.
Did you see the exhibition already?
I have seen the exhibition.
Okay, next to our saddle, there's a section about the weaver. It belongs also to teamwork, where the woman is.
Yeah, but she's talking about Qatar.
Yeah, the Qatar, but like,
And
are you planning
weaver.
on having the women come see the exhibition?
Well, there aren't women who make these particular things, I don't believe, but I would love to learn from you, and I think everybody in the museum would too, in terms of the kinds of materials that, you know, are made. And my understanding of the tent, the Qatari tent, so I wish Faisal or Tanya were here, but my understanding was that it was very much a community affair, because there wasn't a tent. in the collection of the museum, and the permanent gallery only has, I think, a tent divider in it. You know, beautiful sadhu, beautiful weaving. There were hundreds of pages of research done by Qatari, people who work with weavers. As the research packs, I saw them, every detail about the looms and the dyes and the ways the dyes had changed. But my understanding is that they had to actually get people involved, donating bits and actually figuring out how to finish off a tent so that there is a single tent and there isn't another one like this, apparently. So it was very much I don't know, people who are more involved, but that's what I understand. And I think that's really interesting because I believe really strongly that people should be involved and that communities should be involved in museums and making things. What maybe you're hinting at is that there is contemporary weaving that's not represented there, or people who know the kind of weaving traditions. I mean, I know still in Egypt, although the younger generation all want to buy, Chinese synthetic blankets. They don't want these heavy, beautiful rugs that I think are so gorgeous. But there may be revivals.
No, so they still weave the same way. They haven't changed the way that they weave. It's just that they stopped weaving because there was no economic benefit from them on that side. So I was just wondering, this would be a great example to kind of bring them in and revive it, because it is an intangible cultural heritage. It is dying. Qatar hasn't submitted the files yet to UNESCO to save it. As opposed to, say, Saudi and Kuwait and the UAE. This would be a good conversation starter. And I know the women, whenever they do see sadhu, they get really excited, but they also wouldn't maybe necessarily come to a place like the National Museum. Maybe they wouldn't feel like it's a place that they belong. They don't read, they don't write, but it would be a great community initiative.
That would be wonderful. So everybody here, you heard this, and probably Tanya would have an answer about what's already happening in terms of involving the local community and people who have these skills. But I just remember those research packs 10 years ago that were just they worked with women. They had so much information about this, and then, there are 3 pieces displayed. But it would be great. I think that's a really useful suggestion, which everybody here will take forward about reviving traditions through supporting them economically, which happens around the world. Or should we hear just one more? Because we are just about,
So I'm currently a high school student and I'm taking a world history course. And we have learned about various nomadic groups, particularly the Mongols. But what's interesting to me in the course is that nomadic groups are often portrayed in our class in a barbaric, very dehumanized manner, whereas other civilizations in our history that we're learning are glorified and romanticized. So a couple questions I have with that is, what do you personally think is, the cause of this narrative in social science about nomadic groups in particular being, dehumanized? And, how do you guys personally think that beyond like the specialized scope of study, how the average person, in a history course could learn about such groups of people in the most accurate, ethical manner? And then my final question is, like, how do you suppose that a younger generation growing up in an era of constantly wanting to move to the future, how do we maintain a knowledge and love for history and for our past?
We're out of time, but I would say those are really excellent questions. And one of the things we took up, you're probably the most, in terms of how we represent against those stereotypes. How do we reach people? How do we make them think differently? And one of our lessons was, or what we hoped this message, the message that would come through from our narratives was about in the future and the past and the present, and that we have a lot to learn. We have a lot to learn given what's going on on our planet right now from these groups, without romanticizing, but actually learning some lessons from them, which I think is a way to counter either kind of stereotype. But I think you've been the most concerned. We have I know
Are
we
we
only
able
have a
to
minute.
Okay,
but
are we able to? Okay. Why? Where do these narratives come from? The legacy of social evolutionism, which unfortunately is the basis, the beginning of our discipline and as social anthropologists and a lot of social scientists. This idea in the late 1800s that people progress, or groups of people are at various stages of progression, of development. Folks in the West were the most developed. They were Christian. They were capitalist. They were this and this and this. Whereas other folks, hunter-gatherers you had down here, and they had their various forms of religion. They had shamanism. They had animism. Those were the sort of basic forms of development up until other civilizations that were given more prestige and were considered more modern and developed. Horribly racist and problematic. And this is what we're trying to face on. Straight on, because obviously in your textbook and so many other people's textbooks, it's still there. And it's really, really problematic. And so that's where it comes from. And I love the question about thinking about future while mobilizing the past. I think it's about the kinds of stories that we continue to tell about the past and repurpose them, reuse them, reframe them. So we're not forgetting, we're just we're thinking about them in a different way, in a creative way.
I'm sorry, but I think we've run out of time. But I wanted to thank you so much for your presentations. I want to thank you for being here. We can also stay once we get off the stage and talk to you, talk with you about other questions you have or other issues you want to bring up. But these were really fantastic questions. Thank you.